People were stolen from their homes and taken from their native lands. People lost friends and family members as slavers or to people who wanted to make a profit off of them. Can anyone imagine having a normal life and routine, a daily routine, and then have it all gone the next day? I'm sure the majority of people listening to this will never know what it's even like, or even come close to understanding what it feels like, although some people think they can understand it. When we were exploring the trans-Saharan trade route in my Slaves and Eunuchs video, I mentioned about how people similarly died en route to that of the transatlantic slave trade. But there's not a lot of writing on the trans-Saharan slave trade as much as there is of the Atlantic slave trade, due to American documentation, so on and so forth. Maybe Africans just didn't keep records of things like Americans do, or perhaps the Muslim armies banned documentation. I'm not completely sure yet, but here I'm going to present some documentation coming up here in this episode from people that wrote about slavery in Africa during the 15th century, prior to the existence of America or the colonization of the American islands. A lot of people died en route across the hot desert. And it's really interesting that nobody really talks about this kind of stuff. Nobody talks about the trans-Saharan slave trade anywhere that I've ever heard about. Nobody ever references to it at all. They talk about the American slavery, and some people say, yeah, slavery happened for many years, but nobody specifically talks about the trans-Saharan slave trade ever. It's kind of odd. I wonder why. But here's some more insight into it right now. So here's a breakdown of what some parts of Africa were like, and some of the things that happened there. For example, the salt and gold mines were really important in Africa history prior to the European exploitations of the continent. The Muslim and African states wanted their hands on these important items. And to make a long story short, to stay on topic for this video, Tagaza was an important salt mine which largely supplied the interior and southern states of Africa. And so salt retains water, so a lot of Africans needed this salt to survive the hot climate of Africa's regions. They were kind of like the modern-day American pharmacists, where people needed salt to survive and trade. And those that supplied the salt benefited from everyone trying to get their hands on it. Everybody needed the salt to retain their water so they didn't die in the desert or in the heat. So Katamosto wrote about the people that would make the trip to Mali through the Sahara Desert who would require the salt from Tagaza. And Tagaza is located in an area in Africa which is the most driest place in the world. And it gets to be about 118 degrees Fahrenheit on average during the summer. And a lot of people didn't survive this region if they were far from resources, like explorers or traders were off doing whatever they did. They were like, man, I need some water. Next day they're dead. Many slaves died en route to Mali. The historical description of a caravan of 100 four-legged animals that traveled to Mali, only 25% of them would return. So 25% of animals and people, everybody of the caravan would be able to return from their trip. Besides the humans that died en route, the quadruped animals would have a hard time surviving as well. Katamosto said that there were no four-legged animals in the region of Mali because all the animals would die off from the extreme weather. He pointed out that 25% of the caravan would survive the trip, but isn't specific on the ratio of humans versus animals who survived. Humans need less water than animals do, right? Just imagine how much water a horse needs, or a donkey, or a camel, compared to a human. Just figure that out, and then you can figure how much water they had to supply everybody on those long routes. So Katamosto was specific a lot of the times, and he did point out that the Muslim Arab traders and the Azanagi tribe did die on those routes. And if they died, so did the slaves. Because if a captain of a caravan had died en route, assuming that the captain would be the most protected, then everyone underneath him would have it worse than the protected and well-nourished captain. So everyone underneath him would certainly die en route upon the hot desert. because Katamosa did point out that the Arab people and the Azenaki tribe did die. So if they were traveling with a caravan of slaves, then if the captain died, sure enough, everybody underneath him did. The Muslim trader Ibn Battuta wrote about what he saw in Tagaza at the time. I mean, a lot of the people would travel to these salt mines, and they needed this mineral to survive. And so this Muslim dude, he wrote about it, and this is what he said about the location. He said, after 25 days, we reached Tagaza, an unattractive village in Africa, with a curious feature that its houses and mosques are built of blocks of salt, roofed with camel skins. There are no trees there, nothing but sand. And in the sand is salt mines. They dig for the salt and find it in thick slabs. No one lives at Tagaza except for the slaves of the Masufa tribe, who dig for the salt. And they subsist on dates imported from Dara Sijalmasa, and camel's flesh, and millet imported from the Blacklands. These black people come up from the country and take away the salt from there, end quote. So I just wanted to point out what some of the area was like and how some people wrote about it. So I'm bringing here Arab and Christian sources of reference to what parts of Africa were like at the time during the trans-Saharan slave trade, and how people lived off of salt. But I just want to bring up those quotes so you have real source of what was going on, at least in their perspective, right? You know, you can't always trust what a Muslim or a Christian says, right? But anyways, you have some kind of reference. So this Katamosa said that when the shipments of salt arrived at this area, the Africans would break a piece off and carry it to a location for trade. And then they would break a little piece and put in a jar of water to drink, so they replenish the salt in their body that they lost through sweat. And the Africans say that the salt saves them. So the people of Mali then took the salt upon their head and bring it to those locations. Then they had, because the four-legged animals wouldn't be able to survive that region. So these guys all carried the salt on their head to a location. And when these people took the salt, they placed the salt in a particular area in which they marked their territory as ownership of that specific pile. And then there was another group of Africans that came to trade gold for the salt. And this is an interesting transaction that they wrote about, to where the seller would be present at the first day, and he would bring his. I just bought my microphone, but he would drop a pile down, and he would mark his territory as like, this is my pile. Then the next day the seller would not be there anymore, and the buyer would show up and then place an amount of money next to that pile, or gold next to that pile, and he would take off. And then the next day, the seller would come back and see the pile there and say, okay, this is worth it. So he would take that money and leave the salt there. So the next day, if the buyer shows up and that gold pile that he placed there is gone, then he knew that it was a good deal, and then he could take the salt. But if there was like 3 piles there, and then the buyer came and put 3 piles of gold next to each pile of salt, and if the seller didn't like one of the piles of gold offered for the pile of salt, he would only take the 2 piles that he liked and leave the third one that he didn't like. And so when the buyer showed up the next day and seen that 1 pile of gold was left over, that means that there was not going to be a deal, and then he would either have to take his gold back or make a second offer. But he would be able to take the other 2 piles that the gold was missing from, because he knew that it was a good deal from the buyer, or from the seller, I mean. So that's a pretty interesting transaction. And you can see how it worked out back in those days in Africa, in that region, to where people needed salt to survive, especially along those long journeys through the desert. And like I said, a lot of people died. Katamosa wrote that 25% of the caravan, he said the 4-legged animals, but would survive. But he also said that the Arabs, and like I already described, a lot of people would die en route, so they needed the salt, they needed water, they needed a lot of resources to make long, sometimes 30 to 60-day trips across the desert. And if a seller didn't want to make a trade for gold because he didn't think that gold was enough, then if a person didn't have enough gold to make a better offer, then that person's screwed. They're gonna for sure die in the desert. They probably won't make it back to their family to let them know that they couldn't make a deal. So it was pretty rough times there. But Cadamosto is one of the people that I know about that wrote about the people dying en route in the trans-Saharan slave trade. And Cadamosto quoted a lot of the Africans saying that they needed this salt to survive. And it was all up to the buyer or the seller. Because if you didn't think an offer was good enough, you wouldn't sell it. That's kind of sounds like the healthcare system of America in present day. Because if somebody doesn't have enough money to go to the doctor, then they're screwed. And same thing here was going on in Africa in the 15th century, at least in the 15th century that we know about. I mean, it probably happened through years before and after that as well. But a lot of people died because they didn't have resources, salt and whatever else. And I just told you about the transactions. Pretty crazy. You would think that, if everybody was really cool, they'd be like, hey, man, we got this salt. We got the salt mine. We're going to give it away to everybody for free because everybody needs it to survive. And people wished that America would do the same thing with healthcare in America. But it's just a thing that goes on. Everybody wants to make money off of somebody, even people that need it to survive. The doctor's like, sorry, if you ain't got the money, not my problem. Anyways, I think that's a pretty interesting part of history that's not really ever talked about very often. Like I said, there's not a lot of documentation on it, but it did happen. So why wouldn't there be documentation on it? Guess why? You know why. Because they don't want people to know about it. It's just like the fake news of today. They had fake news back then, and people didn't want news to get out. They didn't want certain documentation to go out. But some people wrote about some stuff, but they let them write about it because they only wrote this kind of thing about it. So that's why you got to check a lot of different sources to find like things you didn't know about. So it did happen. So I just want to bring it up. So now everybody has a little bit more insight into the trans-Saharan slave trade and slavery at all from Africa. Anyways, adios. That's it. So subscribe to this channel and thumbs up on the video and comment. And if you don't like this video, you could also share it with your enemies. They'll hit you for it.